Thank you all for joining us this afternoon at our second FC Build conference. So since many of you in the audience are new to FC Build, let me start with a very short introduction to Foundation Capital. So Foundation was founded in 1995. We're an early stage venture firm and managing about $4 billion in capital, and more than 30 of our companies have gone public over the years. We've backed some extraordinary entrepreneurs over the last 2.5 decades, and in our enterprise practice, we've been very fortunate to partner with founders in enterprise infrastructure up and down the stack. So from cloud, data, AI, automation, and DevOps, as well as B2B, SaaS, and cybersecurity. Now, we primarily lead seed and Series A investments, usually before a company has any revenue or even a product, which basically means that we invest in extraordinary dreamers with extraordinary dreams. And we work to make them real. So with that, and speaking of extraordinary dreamers, please allow me to introduce you to our two speakers, Mercy Grace and Ellie Fields. By way of background, Mercy is a product leader and investor who specializes in growth, engagement, and design. She's currently secretly building something in the proverbial barn, and before that was the first head of product and then growth at Slack. Prior to Slack, Mercy founded her own game studio and then spent time as a producer and game designer at Electronic Arts. And in her spare time, she founded the Women in Product community, which now numbers, I think, more than 13,000 women worldwide. Ellie is the Chief Product and Engineering Officer at SalesLoft, a leading sales engagement platform that helps sales teams drive, guess what, more revenue. Prior to SalesLoft, Ellie spent 12.5 years at Tableau, where she started as the very first product marketer and ultimately worked her way up to become the SVP of product development for nearly 5 years. Before Tableau, Ellie spent 3 years at Microsoft and way back 2 years in private equity. So she's also been on the dark side, as has Mercy. So with that, maybe just to kick things off, so you both have had such remarkable careers in and around product at groundbreaking companies, Slack, Tableau, SalesLoft, from their very earliest days. And so I'd love for you just to kind of kick things off with a hot take about this whole product-led growth thing that we're going to be talking about over the next 40 minutes. Maybe I'll kick it off with you, Mercy, and then we'll go to Ellie.
I do love a hot take. Yeah, I think the more that I learn and I continue to learn about operationalizing product-led growth at enterprise companies, the more it seems like the variable compensation model of sales teams is really holding back innovation there. It destroys any kind of psychological safety that people have. You just have to keep hitting that quota over and over again, and it stops people from experimenting.
So no more commissions, or figuring out another way of sort of compensating, particularly in those early days.
Yeah.
Cool. Ellie, what are your hot takes?
My hot take on product-led growth is that it's what we always should have been doing if we were just marrying up sales with the product. I mean, it's I think a company that's simply trying to go high and sell without any product proof is going to struggle. But likewise, I think if you only use product and you don't work to identify stakeholders and get to power and find budget, you're just going to end up playing a lot of small ball. So, at Tableau, we did a lot of this. We didn't call it product-led growth. We just talked about getting adoption with a product, getting organic growth, and then turning that into big deals. Gotcha.
So in your mind, this is a little bit of like a old wine, new bottle in terms of just how it's being marketed. Is that, I guess, are there any of the sort of habits that that product-led growth sort of helps to sort of catalyze within organizations that really is new, or do you really do feel like this is just a repackaging of concepts of yore?
Well, I mean, I think what is new is the ability to look at usage so real time, right? And feed that back to the sales team, but also do things in the product to help grow that usage. And that wasn't as possible in earlier areas of software, and even early in the SaaS days, it wasn't as possible. So I think there is legitimately something new in product-led growth, in the ability to grow that adoption.
Yeah, and maybe the cultural force behind some of that is the autonomy that individual engineers have with, just how competitive it is to hire people, but also these systems are so API driven and operational that a random engineer is often the first person to adopt even a tool like Slack at their company, which even, 10 years ago, I guess maybe more like 10 years ago, you'd think this is a top down, this is a communication budget line item, this is going to be a top down deployment. Instead, it's the 24-year-old engineer, sending memes to her friends at work.
Mercy, I think that's really new. This idea that any user can go get a tool that works for them and it can grow from there. I think that is, that's new and that's very needed in software.
Yeah. One of the challenges, so that's the sort of positive element of this. And to me, it almost feels more like marketing than it does product, right? Like it's, in some senses, what you're saying is I'm going to use the product to effectively build the funnel for then who I will ultimately actually go try to sell kind of top down to, which by the way is I think a perfectly fine way to build a business. One of the things, and you guys just both have such product chops that I kind of want to test this hypothesis on you. But one of the challenges I've observed over the last few years is that this sort of pendulum really does feel like it's swung so far to the sales velocity sort of mentality that kind of like, I remember I used to say sort of 3x, 3x, 3x. And then I remember it was like someone wrote a blog post, I can't even remember who it was at this point, which was the triple, triple, double, double. And I sort of feel like as soon as something sort of gets discovered, sort of a hack gets discovered, it's no longer interesting. And I'm worried actually that we're kind of as an industry in some senses at risk of burying kind of the product lead. And I'd love to sort of like see our companies, for example, triple, triple, double, double their product, right? Like actually invest as much in their product as they are in go-to-market. And so I'm sort of curious if you guys feel at all like, have we forgotten that like building something worth scaling should actually precede scaling it? Like, or do you feel like, no, like we, product is moving quickly and, and now we're just trying to sort of get it in the hands of more users faster? Or do you think we have maybe lost a little bit of that discipline around, working on the product as much as we should?
I mean, I tend to go back to basics on this stuff, Steve. I think a great company can go to market and I think it builds product. And if you go down to the atomic unit of where we build in teams, right? And those teams are most successful when they're building and talking to customers and going to market and learning and growing. I think we learn different things from them. I mean, from go to market, you learn if your message is resonating, right? You learn how your messaging works and if you're targeting the right people. But if you're doing all that and ultimately not delivering, it's going to fall apart. And likewise, if you're building an awesome product, but you can't take it to market, it's going to fall apart. So, I think sometimes we get bent around the axle on these terms and these fads, as you mentioned. And yes, there are better ways to do things and there are things we can learn, but ultimately every company's got to build something and sell it, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. I would also say quality is a hard to measure differentiator, but we did an enormous amount of user research at Slack, for instance, of course, many years ago before it was a public company, trying to dive into, okay, but like, why do people love us so much? And we had that experience as end users. So I had used first IRC with my very first company in like 2007. I ran a remote team on IRC and then FlowDoc and HipChat and Yammer, and we used all of these tools, but none of them had that ineffable level of polish and thoughtfulness around, you say, hey, this looks like a drawer where the forks might be, and you pull it open, and indeed, there are the forks there. And that's a very satisfying feeling. And so I think oftentimes people want to get to that moment of, okay, it works, I've checked the boxes, now we can go sell this, without understanding that the irrational love, that means that you can do things like charge 4 times what your nearest competition is charging for a tool that has fewer features than that. I mean, like, right, that's where you get that, is just with that painting the back of the drawer. Yeah,
good point. You said something, you both did, and Ellie, the way you put the sort of, product without marketing, kind of broken play, marketing without product, same thing. One of the things that I sort of feel like has been a good thing of recent, and regardless of what we call it, is this much tighter integration of product and marketing, as opposed to sort of, the old days where you designed a product and literally chuck it over the transom and kind of hope that the marketing team kind of knew how to bring it to market. and maybe that's really old school, but like all of that manifests itself in much lower CAC, right? And so, which is a great thing, particularly for companies like Slack or certainly Tableau that sort of started as a plugin to Excel. But there's no question as well that like someone on the management team at some point is like, hey, can we have like bigger ACVs? Like those aren't going to come from individual engineers swiping their credit cards. And so then we end up kind of in this sort of bottom up meets top down. And you guys have both lived through that. And I think this also gets to your point, Mercy, from the very beginning around like compensation and how do we think about sort of the right incentives. But when do you think about, and I know this is top of mind for our audience, when is it the right time to start thinking top down? Like, is there sort of a moment, or are there early signals when like, okay, you want to get from the 2,500 ACV to the 25,000 ACV, when I should start to kind of come over the top with the pincher move, if you will? I'd love kind of whatever lessons, and I know both of you lived this firsthand with both of those sort of last companies you've worked with.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think there's it's hard to develop this motion at a company that's been selling smaller. And again, we didn't call it product led at Tableau, but expanding through use of the product, the organic growth, really pushing on that lever. There's a big cultural change to going top down. So all I'm saying by that is that sometimes the exact moment isn't happening at the moment you think it should.
Right.
But that said, I think it's when you've created that value, when you can credibly go to someone with budget, you can articulate the story, you can show the value that's happening in the organization already, and you can feel confident about putting a big deal on the table and delivering that value. Because the first few times you do it, you're going to need those customers to stand up to the next ones and say, yes, I paid it and it was awesome and it's even better now. And so, I think product-led and organic growth is fantastic when you're building out, when you're testing, you're honing the quality. I love the way Mercy said that. I think that is really important. And then when you've got it, I think you go for it.
And in that case, when you're going to that customer and saying, okay, it's time for you to, spend more than 2,500 across 10 users in your eng org, or maybe just distributed across the company more broadly, are you dollar denominating that? Or is it, in other words, you're like, here's the savings, or here's the benefits on the kind of top line, or is it still kind of fuzzy at that phase?
I think you try to dollar denominate it, but it ends up fuzzy.
Yeah, it's still a little bit
maybe that's the truth of a lot of things.
Yeah.
I think one of the questions too is like, do you have the product strategy that takes you into the enterprise, right? So, whether enterprise users are going to get value there, if you have a product-led motion, you probably already have pockets of usage at these larger target companies. And if you started off the company with a product-led motion, you probably have been doing some level of really like founder sales. It's not a sales team, but you're going to your network, you're going to your friends' companies, you're getting in front of, the places where your mentors are on the board. So you're already doing sales. I think one of the things that an early mistake that founders can make is thinking, okay, I'll keep doing this for as long as I possibly can, and then I'll hire a sales team, and then I'll hire a marketing team. And it's like, no, like even when you're the only person who's selling, you need to build that demand and you need to be honing that marketing muscle and figuring out what the right positioning is. But if you don't have a product strategy that leads you from that sort of, here's our smaller team that's using it at this level, into the next adjacent either user base or a set of features that you've defined with your customers that are going to be worth more than I think what a lot of buyers are understandably tired of is paying like the SAML tax, right?
Totally.
It's like, okay, so you built 2FA, which I need, or SOC 2 compliance. And so why is it now,
Yeah, no, exactly. I love that sort of notion of like, put the point on the horizon that gets them compelled to actually want to spend more with you. And I do think you're right. It can't be one of these, like, it's just enterprise readiness functionality, because that in some senses is, it's sort of like refactoring, right? It's like, okay, so there's no real benefit to end users. You may actually feel better about how things work under the covers. But it feels like that's super important. I'd love, this is something I know comes up. So if I think about our earliest founders that are kind of watching this, one of the questions that almost always comes up is, how do I think about which features to give away in that sort of PLG kind of phase versus which features perhaps to have kind of in the, behind the paywall? And there's lots of different ways to sort of think about, like, do you, and what I love about PLG is it sort of also sort of implies a certain level of iteration around this. But like, do you have advice to founders around, hiding your best features or showing them off and giving them away and being more sort of cheapy oriented? But like, what have you observed and experienced that works, and maybe even some of the pitfalls as well?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and it's one to spend time on if you're a founder, because getting it wrong can be pretty destructive. One of the things we did early at Tableau was we launched a free product called Tableau Public, which was pretty full featured in terms of what you could do with the data. So we didn't pull out any features like reference lines or colors or any of those things that would let people really do the type of analysis they wanted to do. We spent a lot of time thinking about how it would be able to grow some of that usage without really cannibalizing our paid business.
Was it too good?
No, we actually through some combination of luck and a lot of discussion, we found a good balance, and it wasn't charging necessarily for enterprise features, but it was segmenting the enterprise. So for example, we gave it away free for files, but if you had a database, Tableau Public wouldn't work for it, because most people out there just using free products for data analysis don't have a database on the back end, right? They're using Sheets or Excel or something. And so there was some combination of those factors. Security, right? I mean, being able to keep your data secure is important for pretty much every company, but not for somebody who's doing analysis about football stats.
Desktop analysis.
And so those were the particular decisions we made. I think those decisions are really important. If you're sorting decisions into ones to spend time on and ones to not spend time on, I think some of those are one-way doors, or at least perceived as one-way doors by your customer base, and they're worth spending time on.
Yeah, gotcha. Lucy, how did you guys handle this at Slack? Because I feel like the sort of, what do you expose to your free users, and when do you kind of like make them actually open their wallets is a big question.
Yeah, Slack has a very generous plan. And it's something that with my co-founder we've debated, how much of the value that we gave away we should have been keeping. I think we really needed that groundswell of adoption. So a lot of it depends on, honestly, what your business model is. And we had a usage-based business model for communication tool where if it wasn't working for a team, one of the top pieces of feedback we got was just not everyone is actually on this. And so we knew that in order to have a great experience, we needed, honestly, 85, 90, 95% of people to be at least WAU on the platform. Yeah. So that became clear. And then almost exactly what Ellie is saying, whenever you can define, okay, this feature means you're really using it for a business use case. You have a database and it's not just a Google Sheet file. There are equivalents for Slack as well, like federated teams. And then, honestly, some of that SAML tax stuff. Yep. But for the early stage founders, people will actually tell you what they'll pay for if you ask them. And if you say, hey, and like, is this table stakes, or is this something that you really need? And how much would sound really expensive? And what's the price point if I told you it solved this problem, but then I told you the price point and your first bit of feedback was like, that seems too cheap to really solve this problem. You can actually get a very clear directional range doing these willingness to pay interviews. Yeah, those are super effective.
Super. So I sort of feel like when we could, I'm sure, spend a ton of time on pricing, and I sort of feel like, again, in every one of our companies, there's this sort of like, feels like a 10,000 mile march on pricing where you just never done, right? Like every time you think you've figured it out, there's another kind of snag to adjust. When you were talking about kind of getting the pervasiveness of the product, it did strike me that, maybe and perhaps this conventional wisdom breaks, but like multiplayer products needing to be maybe more generous in what they give up as opposed to single player. It seems like, where they are fundamentally built around network effects, you might just need to be, just more capacious and generous in those early days.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Awesome. All right, so I want to zoom out a little bit from PLG because you guys have so much experience kind of as general managers and founders, and sort of, living through companies that really have kind of hyper scaled, with, category creating companies. But I'd love to kind of dig into what are some of the one or two anyway of the unforgettable lessons learned, that when you're advising the younger version of yourself on starting their company, what are some of the things that really have had kind of an indelible impression on you? And what I loved about sort of, the feedback we got from FC Build last year was the oh shit moments that people talked, through, the audience through were the most valuable. So yeah, I'd love if you don't mind sort of share some of those really scary moments, kind of the impact it had on you and kind of how it's informed how you think and kind of manage your teams today. Maybe I'll start with you, Mercy.
Yeah, I have one that we did get right, but wasn't a no shit moment, and one that we just never really solved. And so the one that we did solve was early on. The founding team of Slack knew that this was a tool for businesses, and they wanted people to pay money for it. A bunch of people on that team have built fantastic consumer products before, so that was always a part of it. And so, speaking of making data-driven decisions, if you were to look at Slack, you might say, hey, there are a lot of people who are using this for really a social use case, like what Discord ended up doing. Yep. And we had a huge number of these open source communities that were just hammering incredible customer experience team with their requests for slight changes because their Linux box wasn't running the right way or whatever.
And by the way, we're not paying anything.
Yeah, exactly. And they would never pay anything. In fact, they were morally opposed often, right, to paying for software because they're open source contributors. And so we did reach this point where we just had to kind of fire those communities and say, we're not going to do this. And that was incredible. To be in the room when those conversations were happening, because then I was able to leave and hand what I described as a machete to every new hire at Slack who inevitably came up to me and said, hey, I planned my wedding or my Burning Man trip on Slack and I have all these ideas and we need to build blocking and we need to build all of this stuff. And I'm like, here's your machete. This is a tool for businesses. Regardless of what you see in the data, don't look at it, segment those people out, only look at people who are in unique URLs when you're doing, passes through the database. You'll figure it out. This is what it's for, and we are actively ignoring that, and in fact, heavily suggesting to many of those people to get off. And you want to lean in to where the customer is, and so it was this real oh shit. This is a kind of counterintuitive thing to do, but probably one of the most lasting moments for me at Slack.
Well, I do feel like in many products are examples of this, including, by the way, there have been moments when I felt this way about Slack, but I won't take us down that. But where products really do tell this story of just yes and of too many examples of features and functions that get kind of bolted on. And to your point, this very important kind of almost it's sort of, I feel like it's a timeless lesson of strategy is about what we choose not to do. And when you handed the machete, it's okay, the clarity of what we are going to build was so brought into focus. So that's what an awesome example. Ellie, take us through an oh shit moment from your last 15 years.
Yeah, sure. And luckily I have lots to choose from. But one that I will, one that I think was interesting, and this, I'll choose one of this, but this actually happened in a couple of flavors, and this probably happened to many people who have been at early stage companies, and that was when one of the big giants entered our market, right? You wake up one day, you're partnering with one of these behemoths and partnering in various ways, and you wake up and you find out that they're competing. And in the case I'm thinking about, we had a few, couple of months notice. We knew, we knew it was going to be coming, and it's scary, right? It's scary because they have a ton of resources. They can put out a press release on anything, right? What their dog ate that morning, and they're going to get a ton. They're going to get a ton of press for it, and they have a huge usage base, right? And again, I'm thinking of one competitor in particular here, but it happened to us with a couple of the big platforms. And the other thing that's true about a lot of these markets is there's an element of experience good to all these things. Like, you can't look at a screenshot of Slack, for example, and say, oh, that's better, and I can tell. Same with Tableau, right? It's like it produces a dashboard. It is a dashboard, Maybe nicer dashboards, but it's the experience of using it. And so you're in this spot where you've got this giant competitor who's going all in against you. To some extent, the hotness of your company is giving them press because, the rat race is exciting and the press likes to cover it, and they can start just adding people on to their existing plans. And what I learned from a couple of those experiences was that the conversation in the market is not the copy you put on the website that matters, and so does the press release, but it is the ongoing conversation that you have with the market every single day. It's what your users are saying about you. It's what your buyers are saying about you. It's the experience people have when they're in the product, and then they go and hear what a competitor is saying. They want you to switch. And it helped me develop a much fuller understanding of what a conversation centered around a product is. And I'm talking about a conversation with many different actors, including, the companies involved, with the users, with the analysts, everybody. And that was probably one of the best learnings I've ever had.
What emerged from that? Because I almost feel like I need the punchline in the form of the product. Was there something that your team or you changed about how you were talking about that? Maybe it was, I don't know which of the lines of product of Tableau it was, but that, like, all of a sudden there was like, here's how we're going to talk about it. That's very different than we did prior because we were sort of pushed into it as a result of this, potential competitive threat.
Yeah, I mean, all of these markets are moving fast, and so certain things get copied, and so you kind of got to keep finding ways to talk about your product. We used to joke about it. I mean, we used to have to pull out new stories, new ways of talking about every 6 months to a year because it's very fast and cheap to copy messages, right? Whether it's messages on your website or in your sales, and even the way the product looks, like there's a certain amount you can copy, but there's parts of it you can't copy. And I go back to Mercy's comment about just the polish, right? Like honing one use case so it really, really works. And then figuring out how to draw that out through the moments, either in the product, the customers, the analysts, and the new ways to tell that story that break through. And it's constant. I think in a fast-moving market, you've never solved it. You're never done.
You're never done. Yeah.
You're just constantly talking about value in different ways.
Yep. I have this concept, Mercy's heard it before, of sort of product market fit is a liquid, not a solid, because I do feel like, so many people in our industry have this, like, almost like a, you kind of achieve it, and then all of a sudden, like the seas part, or the sun comes out, and like, everything changes. You double your marketing budget, or double down on this thing or that thing. It's like, no, like everything is dynamic in this regard, and your competitors catch up, the technology landscape changes, and you just have to have that sort of growth mindset around this stuff. Mercy, I feel like there's probably a parallel story with Teams in terms of how those guys were, so completely blatantly ripping you all off. I don't necessarily, we don't need to go down that rabbit hole, but maybe I'll weave in the question that Kirsten asked in the comment section, which is like this product versus or product and marketing, kind of like coming back to that sort of integration of product and marketing, narrative and product, these things kind of like self-reinforcing loops. Can you give us sort of some examples of how you thought to and demonstrated sort of that integration and the power of that?
Yeah, so much of it is positioning, like Ellie was referencing, and knowing the power of telling that story. I think one of the superpowers that Stuart has as a founder is he's an incredible storyteller. I could listen to him talk about anything for hours. And I think, all of the tech press also agree.
Yes.
He's like fascinating to listen to. And one of the key insights that he had early on that became one of these things that, again, I repeated to a ton of people when they joined, was that chat is cheap. We were a chat tool. Like, it's chat. That's what it is.
Yep.
And I think that's represented in the database as well. But we never positioned that way. It was a messaging tool because we already knew that all of these other people who were way below that price point that we were going to go for, they were positioned as chat. I did think of Microsoft with the can you imagine Microsoft building a product like Slack or anyone giving a shit that they did if Slack hadn't existed, right? It's like they built that because they saw what we were doing.
Totally. Yeah, that was definitely a copy paste. All right, I want to take one other question, and I have a couple more, but and I think Brian's asking us to kind of get real with respect to enterprise. Because other than games, you really see strong models where PLG is working for consumer direct. I can just tell you, Brian, it for sure works in. Ellie knows this company Mode that I invested in a few years ago, where we definitely have taken advantage of PLG, whether we call it that or not. But the principles of PLG are definitely there. I'm curious, Ellie or Mercy, what are your favorite examples? And Mercy, you've worked in gaming, you understand these kinds of loops, but what do you point to as your favorite enterprise examples of PLG at play?
Yeah, I think, one that people don't talk about being PLG, but is maybe even the most successful PLG company right now is Stripe. I think people think about, a developer motion, that's developers. And it's like, dude, that company has been built on product-led growth. And I think it's a testament to the seriousness of the company and probably also actually the lack of UI that people don't think about it being that way, but code is product. And I think Stripe is a very successful PLG company.
What a great example. And with, developers as their customer, right? As they're ultimately being developer first minded, which I think is also not intuitive to a lot of particularly less technical product people. So, Ellie, how about you? Any favorite examples of?
I was actually thinking of GitHub actually still on the developer front. The GitHub was just brilliant in terms of how they grow. I think it's great.
Awesome. All right. Well, I want to.
One thing on the consumer side, I actually think I think Strava has been amazing on the consumer side for that as well.
Yep. And they were probably, to Mercy's point from way before, just probably more generous than they needed to be in terms of features and functions that they gave away, right? There's a lot you can do with the free version, and the loyalty they built, the community that was, it continues to be super duper sticky. All right. Well, I want to. I'm sure we'll have some more PLG questions coming in over the line. I want to actually step back for a minute and talk a little bit about something that you both have experienced. So, and I sound like the mansplainer here, but I wrote this blog post. It was about a year and a half ago. It was actually my opening Forbes column about why diverse teams. Where diverse is a mix of ethnic, racial, socioeconomic, cultural, that basically building diverse teams was not only a morally correct thing to do, but actually the best strategy for designing the best products. And you both have lived this firsthand. Ellie, I've heard you tell an amazing story of having to tell your, I don't know if it was your boss or someone who'd been organizing a panel and kind of removed your name and swapped in someone else's. Mercy and I have shared lots of stories over the years, but tell us and the group, a story from one of those moments where you experienced firsthand why diversity really mattered and how you fought for it in your own unique ways, through your career of the last kind of 10, 15 years. And Ellie, if you don't mind, can I ask you to share the story that I'm referring to? And I think you've at least shared, at least with me once, I think it was over a casual dinner conversation, but.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. And
Lucy
likewise,
has not heard this story, so I think she'll
Yeah.
find it interesting too.
yeah, it was early days at Tableau, and we were doing a road show, which was really meant to show off our most recent launch. And I had kind of put together the demo and the presentation for the road show, and somebody else was working through logistics and where we were going to be. And I think we were doing 12 cities. I was supposed to do Boston and Chicago, two of the biggest ones, big audiences. You run the show and the demo and so on. And we're in a meeting, kind of going through the plan, and the person was a colleague, a good colleague, we looked at the slate of speakers and cities, and my name was gone from those two cities. And I was the only woman and the only person who wasn't a white guy. This was a bunch of years ago. And the person who was on there was actually a very new person, didn't know the product as well, was probably going to be tough for this person to go and do the demo. And so I waited until after the meeting, and I approached my colleague and I said, "Hey, it looks like I'm off the slate, and A, I've done this a lot before. B, I literally wrote the demo and the presentation, so I know it pretty well. And C, that person's new, and we don't have anybody else on the slate who's a woman, never mind a minority." And it was one of the most interesting moments in my career, actually, because the person who I think very highly of looked at the screen and looked at me and said, "I don't know why I did that." And it was this.
How interesting.
And I got put right back on. I did Boston, Chicago. It worked out great. But it was one of those moments where it was kind of like, the person who will stand on stage should look like this. Yeah. And it's just in the water for all of us.
Yep.
And it was super interesting.
So thank you for sharing that, which is, I remember when you did it at one point, and I was as shocked as I think you were. I'm curious now, I mean, and how you handled it as well, just seems like it was perfect.
Very graceful. Yeah.
Yeah, incredibly. When we come back to the sort of diversity is actually a strength. And I think about the strength that you both have brought to your teams and companies. How does, do you have good examples that I think can be inspiring for our audience, where it's like, no, here is an idea, a part of our product that literally wouldn't be there had it not been for the diversity of the team that was working on it. If something comes to mind, I'd love for that, because I think this really does need to be brought to the fore.
Yeah, early on in my career, not at Slack, at a different company, I had this really pivotal moment where it was a small team. I was a designer and PM. I had put together a prototype, and my friend, who was the marketer, was going to go take people through the usability tests and interview them and ask questions. And the results came back showing that the people who were literally in the Bay Area or in the West Coast of the United States totally got it. Right. Like, they got it. They understood all the language. Like, they really, they saw what we were going for and they liked it. Then literally, if you were in a different part of the United States, even though you're still in our target market of developers, you didn't get it. And that really nailed for me how important just always checking your language, and that, does this word mean this to you? Does that word mean this to you? And then later on at Slack, actually, in one of my last meetings that I ran as the head of growth, we were reviewing something that was going to go out, and we had started to really become an international company. So we had a team that was translating the product. And because my team moved so quickly, it was often like a manual translation. And so we needed to choose exactly that right word. And that's also, I'm sure you both know, the difference in conversion from one verb to another in a button can be 10-50%, massive changes. And so in this room of 7 people who were just, engineers, QA testers, designers, I said, oh, hey, who's fluent in the language other than English? A bunch of people raised their hands. They start counting out the languages. We had 12 languages out of 8 people. And I was the person who I don't want to speak English. And it was incredible. And so we were able to talk about, this verb in Russian, in Farsi, in Japanese, in Spanish, in German, simply because, not because we were paying a service to do that, to overanalyze it, and we were able to choose the right word for that button in that meeting because we had kind of like a United Nations of people just in that room making that decision simultaneously.
And did that experience of like, wow, like here's this huge unlock or this sort of, almost epiphany around things that we wouldn't have known or thought of, did that then inform how you built teams? In other words, like, okay, this was so good. This happened to, this was sort of a happy accident, but now we need to go build in a much more intentional way teams that make sure to have sort of the surface area that you just described, or does it still feel kind of more catch as catch can?
Yeah, I think one of the things is I just happen to be a woman. And so in my career, and I'm a woman who has a lot of like male interests. I'm very good friends with my brothers. I come from a big family. There's a lot that's like kind of masculine about me. And so I would be often the first female hire at a company. And then I would notice a huge change in the way that people related to each other, how polite they were, topics of conversation that came up, and how different the ideas were from one another when anyone was hired after me who is also a woman or a person of color or wow. from a religious background, because you really just do see the world in a different way. And so I knew that, because growth is being able to grow globally and appeal to a lot of people while still, performing this really specific thing, I think we knew very early on that it was something that was going to be important to the company.
That is awesome. Sang just reminded me that there are people from 30, I thought it was 35, but 33 different countries here at Build today, which is pretty awesome. Lots of Europeans, I remember. Ellie, in terms of building teams now that you're running, both a product and eng org at SalesLoft, do you think about this like actively as like it's something that we prioritize for your product teams and your eng teams?
Yeah, it's something I think about every day, and partly because the hiring environment is hard, but partly because tech has been such a great opportunity for so many people, and I think that that it make it's good to open up that opportunity. What in building teams, I think this perspective matters a lot, and I'll tell one other story, which was when I joined SalesLoft about 9 months ago. I was about to do my first all hands with the team, and it was going to be very positive and very happy and excited. And the spa shootings had happened in Atlanta the night before, and I opened up. I started early because I'm on the West Coast and SalesLoft is an East Coast company. Saw it about 5 minutes before I went into my all hands, and I had a moment where I was kind of like, what do I do? Right? Do I have my happy first all hands rah rah, or do I acknowledge it? And I acknowledged it because it felt like I had to acknowledge it. And all of a sudden, from this team, I at that point didn't really know, there was just this outpouring in the comments of almost like a thank God moment. And I think it's sometimes bringing those diverse perspectives is really important into a team to having everyone feel like they can be who they are and they can bring their emotions to work. And we still all got to get our job done. We got to do our work, but I think we've seen a lot of that over the last couple of years, and I like that evolution. I think it makes our world a lot more open and real, frankly.
Wow, that's awesome. I don't know that I can park